Okay, so just welcoming everybody to our meeting today. So the topic that I have for today, let me get what I wrote down so I can get the exact name that I wrote. Was the priesthood band myths and realities? And Alice here is going to help kind of facilitate this discussion. And I originally asked her to talk to us about this because she wrote an article. I think it was for a Utah Monthly, or it was another Substack article. I personally really enjoyed. I appreciated reading it because I am looking for language to use. For me, this is for me. I am looking for language to use to talk about this topic that is both faithful, right? So as a faithful Latter-day Saint, and honest. So I feel like, and I've gone through it a couple of times now, particularly looking at the language of it, because it's hard for me. We just haven't talked about it enough for me to actually feel like I have something that sits really well with me. But I liked how you wrote about it. I feel like your words were helpful for me. So for me, it was nice to, I always feel it's nice. Anytime I come across more and more people talking about this, I'm conscientiously thinking, okay, what does this wording sound like to me? Is this a way I would describe it? Is this how I would say it? So for me, it was really important. It's really important for me to hear that from other people. So that was kind of my thoughts with that. But it's also an important topic, I think, for everybody. I think as we're just starting, crazy enough, just starting to really delve into this as a culture. Long time coming. But you have a good history with this, and I think a great way of speaking to this topic also. So I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself, and then we usually leave this open for, it's pretty open to however you want to do it. You can share with us what you want. It's usually discussion based, but you can kind of flow with it however you want along those lines. So
okay, sounds good. I'm Alice Faulkner Burch. Excuse me. I was born and raised in Oxnard, California, by Cleo Everett Faulkner and Elwanda Dale Faulkner, and I moved here to Utah in 1986. I was baptized a member of the LDS Church in 1984, and that's enough. I'm good with that.
So do you want to how do you want to do this? Do you want to delve into it?
Okay. So did everybody read that article? Because Rachel and I had talked about having everybody read it and going from there. So did everybody read it? Can you raise your hand if you read it? You raised your hand twice, Rachel. Did you read it twice?
Well, I have. But I'll put a link right now to it for people who want to look at it.
Okay.
So that it's there. Let me grab it.
So LaSonia read it. So Marianne and Stephanie are the only ones who did not read it then? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what the article does is I've been wanting to write this article for a long time, and basically to do a very different kind of review of Paul Reeves' book, Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood. And so this is a combination of myth busting and a review of his book. So what I do is I go through and I say what the myth is that has long been talked about, especially on years like this year when the Doctrine and Covenants is studied in Sunday school, and the Proclamation number 2 is part of that study. So what the myths are, and then I counter each myth with the truth from Paul's book. And so in that way, you're hearing pieces of his book as well. So let's start with, for those who read the article, Did you have any questions, or were there any of those myths or those truths that you especially wanted to discuss? Carolyn, did you have one?
I wish I had the article in front of me. The myths, it seemed like I was pretty familiar with the myths, and love just having your perspective on each one of those myths. But I don't think there was anything that I was questioning, like, wow, that's a surprise to me.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. And Lasagna, you said you read it. Did you have any questions, or were there any myths or truths that especially stood out to you?
Just 1 second. Come back to me. I was trying to put away my groceries, and I want to get it up, but yeah, I do. And just give me a minute. I'm trying to situate myself.
You bet. I understand. It took me a while to situate myself because I thought I had another hour and a half.
Okay.
Oh,
Right. I just walked in the door and I was trying to get the cold stuff in. So yeah, but
Yeah.
I have something if I can pull your article up.
And Rachel just put it in the chat.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
But I can start while you finish putting away your items.
Okay.
So one of the myths that I talked about is God's curse on Cain after Cain killed his brother Abel was dark or black skin. Since people of the Black African diaspora have black skin, they too were cursed. That is a myth because there has not been a revelation to any prophet of the church that clarifies what the curse of Cain was, or that declared that people of the Black African diaspora were cursed. There are curses spoken about in the scriptures, but they are not racially imposed. There is no instance in the scriptures of God changing people's skin color as punishment for sin or reward for repentance. Scriptural curses are a separation from God due to sin. Repentance erases the sin and restores God's promised blessings. The persons cursed in the scriptures were fully aware of what their sin was. To say that people of the Black African diaspora were cursed due to sin means that they were cursed without knowing the reason why. God cursing in such a manner would be contrary to the character and nature of God. And the scriptures tell us explicitly that God never goes against his character or his nature when he interacts with us. So why would he have done so to curse somebody with black skin, literally changing the amount of melanin in their skin as a curse? It does not coincide with who he is. That is not something he does. The falseness of that is written all throughout it. And that is one way to be able to identify when somebody is telling a myth or a falsehood. Rachel, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so I have a question and maybe
Yes.
a comment first. Question, and then I will say something, and I'd be curious what anybody here may know about this. I'm curious, and I kind of have read a little bit, like I've read, some of Paul Reeves' book about this and just various other, but I haven't delved deep into this, like really, really deep, where that even came from. I know it was like kind of part of what people believed at that time, but before people answer that, just so it's interesting to me when I was young, growing up in the church, I briefly would hear people like allude to this concept, and I remember thinking that's ridiculous, and then move on with my life. I didn't actually realize that people like this was actually something that was perpetuated throughout the church as like a real teaching. So that was really strange to me. I mean, when I heard it, I just kind of like, obviously not true. That was kind of the box I put it in. So I just didn't realize that it was something that was, I mean, taught in a part of our doctrine. I shouldn't say doctrine, but a part of our cultural, what we taught culturally. But then back to my question, I am curious if you know, like, where did we pull this from?
So although leaders of the church will say that falsehoods from other religions have not penetrated the policies or doctrines or culture of the LDS Church, that is not true. Because keep in mind that in the beginning of the church in 1830, none of those 6 people who originally started the church were members of the LDS Church, right? Most of the members, some had never been part of a religion, right, in the beginning days in the 1800s, but most of the people came from some religion. They came from Methodist, a lot from Catholic. There were some that came from the Campbell group of religionists and other religions. So especially with the Catholic religion, and I don't remember which pope it was. He's the one who started that that people with deeper melon are cursed of God, and our skin color is a sign that we are cursed. Because what he did was he sent out the knights to fight, to do the raids and to fight in the wars. And when they encountered somebody with darker skin than theirs, they didn't know what to do because they had never seen anybody. And so when they took it back and they told the Pope about it, the Pope said, okay, well, those people are cursed, so it's okay if you kill them, because you are actually relieving them from the amount of time they have to live in this state under that curse. And so that's where it began, was way back then. And it has been, have you ever played that game? And it's been played different ways, where you whisper something in somebody's ear.
Online.
Yeah, and the next person whispers it to the next person and so on. Okay. And by the time it gets to the last person, the person conducting the game says, share what you heard. And that person shares, and then they say to the first person, share what you said. And they don't match up exactly. It's not exactly the same thing. And so the same thing with this myth about the curse. It has been perpetuated within not just the LDS Church, but other churches as well. And within different areas of Africa, it was something that was perpetuated. And that's why when the Dutch arrived in South Africa, they felt it was okay to kill the darker skinned South Africans and for them to come in and take over the land, because these are accursed people, right? And so it isn't something that is unique and singular to the United States. It is a teaching that has been taught in several countries. 2 countries that are most similar to the United States when it comes to whites and blacks is Germany and England. So the cultures in those 2 countries matches the culture here as far as race relationship goes. Other things in the cultures, of course, are very different. But as far as those 2 things go, for example, in England, black English people could only live in a certain area of England, and white English people were not allowed to even go in that area. I mean, you just could not even go where they lived. It was more than being against the law. It was forbidden. If you went, you were unclean. Your family would be not dishonored. I'm trying to think of the word. Um, your family would be shamed by it. I mean, just so many things. And so even the idea of interracial relationships there mirrors how the idea of interracial relationships here in the United States. Does that help a little bit? Okay. And then Carolyn and was it Stephanie who had their hands raised? I only
Yeah.
still see Carolyn's. Yeah, Carolyn and Stephanie. Yeah. So Carolyn, do you want to go ahead and go first and then we'll go to Stephanie?
I guess when I read this article, the question that kept coming up was, how were you feeling at the time that you were hearing at least some of these myths? Maybe not everything, but what was that personally like for you? I didn't realize you were a convert too. And what year did you join?
1984.
1984. Okay. Yeah, what was that like for you, Alice?
So I joined in California, and I never heard any of these in the
Never.
ward.
Oh, wow.
Never
Huh.
in the ward that I attended. And when I was baptized, I attended a singles ward. So I never heard any of these myths. Never heard any of these. It wasn't until I moved to Utah that I started hearing these myths. But also, I was raised to know that there were people who believed that Black Americans were cursed, but I was raised and taught that Black Americans are not cursed. I was raised that I am, just as good as any person, if you're looking on the outside, and that there are a lot of, and this is what I was taught. I was taught that there are a lot of white people that I am much better than as a person than they are in being a person. And I was taught that you can't go by somebody's looks or the amount of money they make or the kind of job that they have, because people are people everywhere you go. There are good people, there are bad people, there are vicious people. There are people who will stab you in the back the first moment they get, and people who will continue to stab you. There are people who will smile at you in your face, and behind your back, they will do otherwise. And these people have long hair, short hair, no hair. These are men and women. These are Black Americans. These are Africans. These are white Americans. These are Norwegians. It doesn't matter what their ethnicity. People are people everywhere.
Yep.
And so, Stephanie, did that answer that for you, Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, that is real. I'm really glad you had that experience, Alice. I mean, I don't know if I've ever talked to anybody who wasn't taught those myths.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy that was the case for you.
I know the first time I heard those, it was in my ward here in
Wow.
Utah after I had moved here.
Wow.
And the first time I heard them, I knew they weren't true. I knew that it was a myth. And it's been interesting to me how the myths are believed more strongly in some areas that I've lived
Yeah.
in, and some, being in some wards than in other wards. Yeah. Stephanie, you had your hand up too. Oh, Lasonia. Sorry.
I was just going to say kind of what I was going to respond to what Rachel said.
Yes.
And the thing is, I wasn't born under the covenant either. And I've been to other churches, and it's just like somebody told me once or asked me once, how is it you can go to a church that puts down Blacks? And I said, so what church didn't?
Right.
Okay. First of all. Second of all,
Yep.
It was formed in 1830 And how long was it before we, quote, quote, restored the priesthood?
Mhm.
And I said, and if you're Catholic, when was your first archbishop ordained? You know?
Mhm.
So, but I don't know, Dallin H. Oaks, is it, who talked this past general conference? Because I always thought about my life, and I've always, even though I didn't go to church and I had a hard life, I thought it was the Spirit of the Lord. But when I listened to his talk, and it's like, oh, I had the Spirit of Christ leading me my whole life.
Mhm.
And because of that, it's just like when religious people talk or tell me what it says in the Bible, it's like, that's not what God said, you know? And
Mhm.
it just gets me how people can just take words and change it to their own benefit.
Right. And like I said, that is always, it's, for me, it became really important. Remember, I'm in this thing, Robert. Okay.
Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as an attendee in listen-only mode.
Did I do that? Oh.
It did it itself.
Oh, okay. And so when I joined the church, it became, I had already started and was studying the Bible before I joined, but upon joining, it became even more important to me to know the scriptures for myself. Because I would sit in class and I would hear things and not knowing especially the Book of Mormon, because it was newer to me than the Bible was. I would hear things that did not ring true to me. If that makes sense to you, my whole being would just reject it, you know. And I had learned by that time, as a 20-something-year-old, that whenever my being did that rejection, it was because something that somebody just said was either a lie or it was a falsehood. If they're teaching, then it was a falsehood. If they were saying something to me about whatever, then they were lying to me. And that's just always been something that I've had. And so it became very important to me to study the scriptures and to know them for myself. And one of the things that I decided most important to know was to know the character and nature of God. And I remember when I returned from my mission. So I was baptized in 84. I went on my mission in 87 and returned in 88. So when I returned from my mission, there was a book called The Teachings. No, well, there are two books. The Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith was one, and another one was, I want to say it was called Faith by the Prophet Joseph Smith, and I can't remember the title right now, but he talks very heavily about the nature and character of God. And so I read those books, I studied those books, and then as I would read from the scriptures, I actually would mark. I chose a color and I would mark in my scriptures, the nature or character of God was this color. And then after I went through and studied and did that, then I'd go back and I would just read those items, the nature and character of God. And so I knew and understood as best as I could then. I know and understand better now, but I knew and understood as best as I could then the nature and character of God. So when I'd be sitting in class or in sacrament meeting and somebody said something, I knew what they were saying when they said, and God does this and God's like this and this is how he is when we've sinned. And God doesn't love us when we sin. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. That's people. People don't love one another when we do wrong, but that is not God. That's against the nature of God. That is against his character. That is not who God is. And so I was able to tell for myself whenever somebody was teaching or saying a falsehood. And then I began to realize that when a falsehood is told within the confines of when they are saying that falsehood, within the confines of that is located the clues or the markers, however you want to say it, that indicate false, 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 false. And that adds up this whole thing that they're saying is false. But this one little thing they said right here, it is true. And if we look and we're aware when people talk, we can pinpoint what those markers are. And so we would be able to identify when something is false because of how it falls on our ears after a while, and also because of how it literally falls on us or hits us, literally how it does that. And Marion, you were next with your hand up. Oh, okay.
I have a comment before I ask my question.
Okay.
Because this is kind of, I loved your analogy in your article about the homemade bread soaked in butter. Love that mainly because I love it so much. That was so descriptive to me. I tell you what, learning history is similar. You're saying that it's like eating homemade bread.
It is.
And
To
how
me, it is.
Yes, where it fills you with nourishment and warmth is how I think you described it.
Yeah.
Which I agree, except this history, what I'm learning now is not homemade bread and butter. This is painful, so painful to the point of tears and grieving. And sometimes I have to put it away because it's challenging the very core of what I've been taught and who I am. So I just want to throw that out there if we want to talk about that sometime. But I have a question.
Okay, let's stay right there for just a second.
Okay.
So if you're accustomed to eating store-bought bread and your mom, your sister, somebody beloved to you, somebody close to you makes homemade bread, you're going to go, oh, this is really different because your taste is for the store-bought bread and it's different, right? Store-bought bread and homemade bread are so different. I remember the first time Mama bought store-bought bread, I would not eat it. My brother and sister would eat it, but I would not eat it. And Mama didn't understand why I wasn't eating the bread. And I said, it doesn't taste right. There's something wrong with it. Okay. So if you're accustomed to store-bought bread with all of its preservatives and additives and its shelf life that has whatever, right?
Nothing.
When you eat homemade bread, fresh homemade bread, it will taste very different to you. It just tastes very different. It's the same, like Robert and I went to it was like a farmer's market at the Gateway in Salt Lake City. And the first time we had ever been there. And I bought microgreens. Have you ever heard of microgreens?
Yeah.
Awesome. Shame on you for not telling me. Oh, so we bought microgreens, and I made a salad out of the microgreens, and oh my gosh, the burst of flavor, the microgreens, miniature little greens, but the flavor is stronger. It's bigger,
intense.
Than in the regular sized greens, and such a difference, right? The flavor is so different. So the reason why, as you read this history, it is painful to you. It's like my analogy of eating store-bought bread compared to homemade bread. You are getting the taste of homemade bread after so many years,
Mhm.
right, growing up and all these years, you're an adult now, and you're just now tasting homemade bread. And somebody's saying to you, you have to eat this. You can't eat this store-bought bread anymore. You have to eat this now. And you're thinking, but I don't like it. It doesn't taste what I grew up knowing as bread. It doesn't taste right to me, right? That's what makes it painful, is because it is very different for you. It
Mhm.
isn't because, and this is why it's so important that we always teach truth. And and when we share our personal opinions when teaching or speaking, we state this is according to Alice 101. And yes, herbalism. Yes, Lasagna, that's a great analogy. I take a lot of herbs, and because I do, my body is a lot cleaner than somebody's body who has taken, growing up and as an adult, a lot of what I call chemical meds, manufactured meds, right? It doesn't take me much meds for my body to respond to it, but somebody else, it will take them a heavier dose of meds for their body to respond to it. And that's another analogy of the difference. So let's say, you've been taking, a kind of medicine, and you think it's been helpful to your body, to your being, because we're talking about the whole soul, the soul being the spirit and the body together, right? Your whole soul. In Spanish, that's called the alma, right? Um, and you're thinking, this just isn't right. There's something weird here. And for you, there is something weird there because of what you've been accustomed to. And this is why I really dislike all the years of the perpetuation of the myths of the priesthood and temple ban, and the myths about people of the Black African diaspora. Because when people find out the truth, when they learn the truth, it is very, very painful for them. It hurts them. A lot of people, Robert and I have met a lot of people who have left the church because they've learned that church leaders, including general authorities, have lied to us, and they just can't handle it, and they leave. So it is painful for a reason, but I promise you that, as you sit with it, you don't have to rush through the learning of it. Sit with it, give your being time, and help your being to remove the falsehood from your being. Help your being to do that. Because if your being is trying to do that by itself, that makes it even more painful. You need to help yourself remove it from you. And that will make the process a little easier. It's going to be more difficult because you've held the falsehoods longer, and the truths are still so new to you. Okay?
Yeah.
And what was the second thing you had?
Well, it's another piece of store-bought bread, and it's in relationship to what you said
Okay.
about not having heard any of this until you came to Utah.
Yeah.
Now, I have always heard, so it's kind of a two-point question. First of all, and let me ask both questions, and maybe you can put this together for me. Is it a Utah thing? That's question number one.
Yes.
Question number two is, and this is the store-bought bread, I have heard
Yes.
my whole life that there are Utah Mormons and mission-filled Mormons. And when mission-filled Mormons come to Utah, they say we're different. Now, growing up, I would look at that and say, well, get a grip, because this is Utah. We've got the leaders, we've got the truth, this is the right thing. But as I've talked about this with my family this past weekend, I realized that I have been deceived. That what I defended as a Utah Mormon as being right and true, and the rest of the world better get used to this.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the Utah Mormons that are wrong. And we need to expand to look at what's happening out in the mission field. I don't know how, that's my store-bought bread. Those two things. Tell me what the homemade bread is to those two things.
The homemade bread would be like how it was when I was in California. I've lived in 3 different locations and have visited other locations where I attended church. And I would honestly say when I visited New York, when I went on vacation and attended church, I have never had that kind of a reception at a ward. It was just so amazing to me how accepting they were of me. And I was there with a white American friend, and she was actually put out by how accepting the ward members were of me. They were accepting and welcoming of her, but she saw how accepting they were of me as a disgrace. And so when I was in Chile, it was a different atmosphere. And if you can understand that culture is not just carried by people of one country compared to another country, but culture is had within our individual homes, as well as within our individual wards and cities and states, then you understand that culture is something that we heavily influence and that we are also heavily influenced by. And the culture is different from state to state. And I would highly recommend, if it is something that is affordable to you, and it doesn't even have to be an expensive thing, that you go visit places outside of Utah, and while you're there, you attend church. I would also highly recommend that you visit a Black run church and just sit and take in how the teaching is done, how the speaking is done, the culture that exists within the church, and then because I think it would help you to understand a lot about how you have been so influenced by culture. It is difficult to see, looking out from ourselves, the influence sometimes that culture has had on us, but it is there. It is definitely there, and that is the bad things about culture would be the homemade bread, and would be the store-bought bread. The good things about culture would be the homemade bread, and good things like in the Black American culture, our food is a good thing. It's just comfort food, period. Most of it isn't good for us, but it's just all comfort food, and it tastes yummy, and it's tied to so many memories that we don't even know we have, kind of like green Jello salad and funeral potatoes, in the LDS church in Utah,
That's Utah Mormons right there.
It is, and more. It is that, and even more. Yeah. And LaSonia, I'm so sorry. We're so late in getting to you. LaSonia, go ahead, please, dear.
I just want to honestly make a total comment, as Marian said first. Thank you, Alice, so much, because you are speaking it exactly the way I have either experienced it, my thoughts with it. I'm like you when you talked about being other religions and learning scriptures, like truly the Bible. I went to a Catholic school. I was raised in a Baptist church. I attended Catholic, with Pentecostal. I mean, I was involved with all of them. But, and I was that way as a young child, like, because I went to Catholic, school at the time. So, the Bible was definitely a part of it. And for me, the fact was that missing, where they always say, bring what you have and see what we can add to it. And so the LDS church, when the missionaries brought to me, for me, it was the pre-existence. That was something I had never heard anywhere else. Nobody, and I had literally been told it's not important. What do you mean it's not important? I feel like some parts are missing out of Genesis. Where's the rest of it? And that was just my feeling. And so, I think that having that testimony before you really get in, like you said, knowing God, knowing who he is, and being able to know, like, tune your ear to the fact is, that don't sound right, even, and being able to kind of bucket, in a sense, not in a disrespectful way, but to be able to say, that doesn't sound quite right. And 9 times out of 10, if you say something's not quite right, somebody else is going to start asking what you think about the leaders after Brigham Young, that it took somebody else asking, because, God is a free will. He's a revelatory God, and he's willing to give it to anybody and everybody that's willing to ask. But if you don't ask, he don't volunteer. Does he allow things to happen? Oh, most definitely he does. Because he figure, you know what, y'all gonna have to work it out, because that's life. And I learned that, and I wanted to say, when you were talking earlier, there are several myths that you wrote, and then the truths, and I love them, and I'm just gonna kind of list them out right quick. The one was, when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was established, racial distinctions and prejudice were common and customary among white Americans due to slavery. And I loved what you said there. We know that slavery existed even before the church. So we know that was. So we know that all of that was a part of things. And then, if Black people were not cursed and the ban was not of divine origin, God would not have allowed Brigham Young or any other president to teach that it was. Again, that's God allows things to happen. But, when I did this deal in Omaha, it took, like, I've been a member for over 30 some years. And so, I look at things all the time and I'm like, that don't seem right. I felt lonely and not belonging, but that desire of, if I was to leave the church, which I didn't, I got this fellowship and I fell away, because in Utah, and I'll just state it because I don't care. In Utah, I got lost in the cracks. Like, when I was in Utah, I was young. I didn't have a lot of support. And after being in the temple, yada, yada, I ended up becoming pregnant. Nobody in Utah knew I was missing. Nobody ever checked in. Nobody ever cared. If you didn't fit into the Brigham Young family, all the popular, I call it cliquey kind of thing at the time, because that's really the way I kind of see it. If you didn't fit into that, you didn't belong. You weren't thought about. Nobody checked in on you. So I fell in those cracks when I was in Utah. And it took me leaving Utah, coming to Omaha the very first time. And I'll never forget that my bishop in Omaha and my home teacher at the time, had it not been for them, I would have probably not come back into the church, because when I was evil, because I lost the spirit, and I didn't show up, they came looking for me. Like they were like, if I wasn't there at church, where are you? You know, whatever it was, they were truly in their calling. Like the bishop was, they cared about their flock and they looked after their flock. That is what got me back active, along with I Am Jane at the time. So all of these things kind of played into, and so that was my experience. But now when I came back to Utah, I mean, not Utah, Omaha the second time, and I ended up in Winter Quarters Ward, I ended up in Shenandoah, and I'm going to call them out. The bottom line is totally different. My family experienced horror, okay? Nothing personal, not because the gospel's not true. The gospel's true. But the ward, and I think that there's so much that played here, but the bottom line is that I learned during this event that Heavenly Father stated in Doctrine and Covenants 136, I'm telling you, I'm living by that. He called everybody, the camp of Israel. When he was sending people to Utah, he basically called the Omaha Nation, the camp of Israel, and Winter Quarters. That's how he named it. Jane, Manning, Jane, all of them were here. They were part of Camp of Israel. There was no, oh, you're black, you're this, that was not God. When God gave that revelation to Brigham Young, he did not distinguish anybody. And Brigham Young, honestly, did not have any of those things. Now, he had experiences here. William McCrary, yes, we'll call it out. William McCrary was very here, and it really had a lot to do with interracial more than it had anything to do with anything. But all of these myths, what you were saying, I just totally agree. And I did not know that until I started doing the work with this. And then after I'm sorry, I'll just say really quick. After I did the work, I learned from a lot of people some really things that troubled me about the church that I was not happy with. And I had to sit with that. And it was really difficult, what you said about when Blacks find out the truth about things, then they want to leave. That is something I have a problem with. Because to me, if you have a testimony of the gospel and Jesus Christ, God, whoever tells you, because that's 9 times out of 10 how we got here, there should be no one that can push us away. Now, do I go to church right now? Absolutely not, because they make me have anxiety attacks. And I don't think nobody's worth that. But do I go and I attend? And when I have opportunities to go to other wards, like my daughter's ward in Lincoln, I will go. But outside of that, God ain't told me I have to go back yet. Because if you're making my heart go crazy, I'm going to stay home.
Myths and falsehood exist not just in the priesthood and temple ban, but they exist in all kinds of things all around us. And once we learn how to tell what a myth is, what it sounds like and how it feels, what a falsehood is, how it sounds and how it feels, we will be able to spot them in all parts of our lives. And the important part is learning the character and the nature of God when it comes to the scriptural aspect, the religious aspect of our lives, and people are talking. I want to go to something LaSonia said, and she talked about William McCrary. One of the myths, and I wanted to use him, and then I thought that I should not. One reason is because when my article was edited, a lot was cut out. And so, anyway, so the myth is this. Since the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true, it is not possible for teachings without light and knowledge to creep into the church and last for so long. This is the myth. This is a falsehood, because in this instance regarding the ban, the racial restrictions took on a life of their own. Listen to what I'm saying, because this applies to anything. The racial restrictions took on a life of their own after Brigham Young first presented them, with leaders defending them because of their personal biases, members teaching them, and presidents and leaders unwilling to go against previous generations. They were not set in stone, nor were they poured down from heaven. Perpetuation of myths, which lack light and knowledge, is what continues to give the myth renewed breath and steam through each generation. There are several instances of teachings without light and knowledge, meaning they're void of truth, being taught in the church and being sustained and perpetuated by the members. This has happened throughout history. It didn't just happen with the priesthood ban. William McCary is a very famous instance of this happening. False teachings being taught and the membership believing it, sustaining it, and perpetuating it. It was almost a totally devastating period for the church. President Smith worked diligently to remove it. Brigham Young got an awful taste in his mouth from books that I have read about him and the time period because of what happened. The things that took place. Is everybody familiar with William Carey and what he did back in the day? A little bit, Rachel. Are the rest of you? LaSonia, I know you are because you mentioned him. Carolyn, are you familiar with William Carey? You're muted, so give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Sorry. I need a refresher.
Okay. And Marion, are you familiar with William Carey? Okay.
No, I'm not.
Okay, so William Carey and LaSonia, help me along here. William Carey started this movement of belief that single women and even some married women could be advanced along spiritually if they had sex with him. And so he was able to deceive a lot of people. He deceived the husbands of women. He deceived women, both married and single, because of this. And he taught that while he was having sex with these women, it wasn't like having sex with their husbands, because while they were having sex, it was a highly spiritual thing that lifted. This is what he taught. And so he did not just deceive women. You know, we might say, oh, those silly women back then. But it wasn't just the women. It was married women's husbands as well who were deceived. And so these women, their husbands, and single women followed him because they believed in this. Well, after a while, what was going on came to the ears of, yes, and they were white women. Yeah, they were white women. They were white American. Yes. So after a while, what was going on came to the ears of Joseph Smith. And he had to put a stop to it. And he just came right out and he said that, you know, this was not true. This is not how you obtain a higher spiritual level. Okay. Another instance was with the stone. Do you remember the stone? And I can't remember who had the stone. It was called a reading stone or something. And one of the members, what was it?
Hiram Page.
Yes. And he called it like the reading stone or something. And so he had this stone and he claimed to be receiving revelations directly from this stone because this stone came from God. And there were members of the church who believed him, right? None of these two that I've shared with you had light or knowledge within them, but the members believed it, they accepted it, and they followed these people. So how can something be perpetuated? It doesn't take a lot to perpetuate a myth, to perpetuate a falsehood. It really doesn't. In our own lifetimes, because Rachel, I know you're not too young that you would not remember Jim Jones and how he took his whole church to I can't remember where they were. I'm sorry. And
South America, I think, or Mexico.
yes, and he taught them certain principles, and he taught them that they were now going to ascend higher, and they were going to be higher and greater than anybody else was who was outside of their group. Do you remember what he did, Rachel?
Is this the one where they all were math, like they all killed themselves or something? There's a couple
was
people there.
They drank the Kool-Aid. That's where that saying comes from. Oh, he drank the Kool-Aid. Oh, you must have drank that Kool-Aid. You know, that's where that saying we have today comes from, is because he put poison into the Kool-Aid and they all drank it. And it was mass murder, basically, because he killed them. I mean, they were aware of what they were, that they were going to ascend higher. But
I'm sorry to interrupt. I am so sorry. You brought that up. I literally told one of my bishops, I said, no, sir, I will not drink the Kool-Aid. I literally told him that. It's funny that you brought that up. I literally told the bishop that.
So when people ask you if the priesthood ban and the teachings surrounding it are false, there's no way that God would allow teachings without light and knowledge to creep into the church or to last for so long. These are stories that you can share with them from history. And this is why knowing history, learning history is so important, because contained within the myth are the clues that it is a myth itself. God would not allow falsehoods to creep into the church to be taught for so long. So it is the members that perpetuate myth. Yeah, the believers of the myth perpetuate it. Yeah, they teach it to their children. They teach it in lessons if they're called to teach a class. They teach it when they give talks. I remember one of the nicest men in our ward was called into the bishopric, and I was so happy because he was so cool. He was so nice. And I remember the day he got up and he chastised the ward for the families, the parents in the ward, for letting their children play with children who were not members of the church, that they would lead their children astray, and it would cost them as parents, their children, their spiritual lives, and in some cases their physical lives, and it would cost us as a ward these precious spirits who were part of our ward. And I sat there in just utter disbelief, like, oh my gosh, I really liked you. I really liked you. And I just couldn't believe he was telling them this myth, this falsehood. Children go astray for so many reasons. Children go off into another path for so many reasons. Because they have a friend who is not a member of the church is not necessarily a reason that children will go off onto another path, that they will try smoking or drinking or get into drugs or whatever, and there are a lot worse things than smoking a cigarette. And I say that from having been a 9-year-old who smoked. I smoked when I was 9 years old because it was the cool thing to do. And I smoked for about 2 years and learned what cigarettes do to the body. And then I started shaming Mama. You need to stop smoking, Mama. But there are worse things to do than smoke a cigarette. There are worse things, killing somebody would be worse. Raping a woman, raping a young girl would be worse. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
You were right when you said you got to know the nature of God. You got to know the nature of Christ. And if you do know the nature of both of them, you know that no matter what you do, no matter how low you go, if you repent, they will come after you.
So let's do one more, because this is important to me, and that people understand this, because it encompasses so much. Myth: church membership of Black people can be dated to when the gospel was taken to Africa. This is false. And here's the truth. The first Black American man to join the church was baptized in 1830, 7 months after the church was organized. This man, whose name was Peter, was baptized in Kirtland, Ohio, and worshiped with the other members there. The first baptisms in Africa were in South Africa in 1853, and then Brazil, and then the next people of the black diaspora. I'm sure they called him that. LaSonia, I'm sure they called him that. And then the next baptisms of a group of people of the Black African diaspora was in Brazil in 1966. And then the next ones were in Ghana in 1978, after the priesthood ban had been removed. This is important because what this says is that the difficulty, the pinpointed racism and bias was not against African people. It was against one group of people of the Black African diaspora, and that is Black Americans. And when I say Black Americans, I mean those people who are descended from the people who were brought here and enslaved, and who stayed here and had children generation after generation after generation after generation. These are what I term Black Americans. Some people refer to them as African Americans, but to me, they're not African, because these people, my ancestry, our ancestry of those of us who are here now, never even knew Africa, right? So this was a not a headbutting, but it was directed towards this singular group of people who were enslaved, came out of enslavement, were receiving civil rights, were receiving equality, were receiving equity under the law, protections under the law, who were being declared as people, as real people, and as citizens of the United States. This adversarial relationship that white Americans have had towards Black Americans has gone on for a long, long time. There have been lies to get in the way. There have been the perpetuation of myths that have gotten in the way. And there has been with the perpetuation of myths that has happened, there have been, they shouldn't have the right to do whatever, separating us. They shouldn't have the right to do whatever, separating us. They shouldn't have separating us and separating us further. Think about why it is so important that Black Americans and white Americans be separated instead of brought together as the Americans that we all are. Why has it been so important to separate us? Who would do that? Whose plan is that? Whose intention is that to separate people? Because that isn't God's plan. And remember what I said? The myth, the clues to a myth are held within the myth. Church membership of Black people can be dated to when the gospel was taken to Africa. How do we know that was a myth? Because we know that there were Black people living in the United States when the church was founded in 1830 in Ohio. There were Black people living in Ohio. There were Black people living all over the East and the Midwest. Jane Manning James was living in the East when she heard about the church. Other people were living in the area when they heard about the church. But this myth separates Black Americans from the history of membership in the church. Why? I'm going to leave you with that question to ponder, and we're going to go ahead and that's a good place to end, Rachel.
Okay, hold on just a sec. You will hear screaming in my background occasionally in my house. So just pretend like it's not happening.
Whoever could be screaming.
I know. Well, no, I appreciate that thought. That's actually something that I want to sit with a little bit. Hold on just a sec. Well, maybe we'll just end it because I've got screaming, but I want to thank you. And actually, if anybody has any other closing thoughts for that, I like to look at things. What was the last question we had? The last time, I feel like when we have these hard things to sit with, what helps us, I like the word metabolize, maybe. How do you metabolize it? So maybe if somebody has some good closing thoughts, and then we'll end.
I would say to metabolize this is to use the article as a guide. If you've already read Paul's book, if you haven't read it, because I really, the number one and number two books that I highly recommend that everybody read are Paul's book, Let's Talk About Grace and Priesthood, and Matthew Harris's book, Second Class Saints. Because while Paul's book tells you where every myth, that's pretty much every myth that's in the church or has been in the church, originated. Like, for example, the myth about Black people were not valiant in premortality. That comes from Orson. Why do I always get the brothers mixed up? It comes from Pratt, the one who debated with Brigham Young on the legislative floor. Whichever Pratt brother that was, it comes from him.
That was Orson.
Orson. It comes from Orson because he was looking for a reason why a certain group, a certain number of people would be born with darker skin than so many other people would be. And that was what he came up with. So that myth that Black people were not valiant in premortality, that myth comes from Orson Pratt. And in his book, Paul tells you the minute he says that, because he gives the quote and he gives the reference to when he said it. So I would use this article that I've written and just go through each myth and see which ones you have believed, like mark off believed or believe now, and then use it to work through the myths that you still believe. And you can also use it to not evaluate, but to help you see where you're at and getting rid of the myths that you're sure no longer exist within you. You know, this I'm pretty sure I got rid of this myth. I used to believe it, or it was taught in my home, but it doesn't exist with me, and then use that and say, how do I know it doesn't exist with me? Because, because why? What does your talk sound like? What does your walk look like? What does your interfacing with people who do not look like you? What does that look like? And just use that. But read Paul's book, study Paul's book, read and study Matthew's book. Oh my gosh, Matthew spent years researching for his second-class saints, and he did that book so that people could heal. And it's past time. And it's past time that another generation should not believe that the priesthood and temple ban came from God, because it throws people into a false faith crisis. And I say false because they're thinking that it came from God, and it didn't come from God. And then they ask, well, why would God do this to these people? What did they do to deserve this? Why would God treat them this way? And then they go on this mission to find out why God this, why God that, why did you do this? Why God, why'd you do this? And it's a false track, because God didn't do any of it. None of it was done by God. And then when they realize that none of it was done by God, then they have a hard time coming out of it. And so many people leave the church. And I don't care if people leave this church, to be perfectly honest. I do care that people are leaving God. And that right there is the saddest part of all, is that people are leaving God over the myths and falsehoods that are still being told and that are still being believed. People who are perpetuating all of this, that is what they're doing. They're taking these people away from God by perpetuating all of these myths and falsehoods.
Thank you. I think that's great advice and some good stuff for us to look at. I'm familiar with both those books, and I've read Paul Ray's book at least. So, and I do want to look at Matthew Harris's book. So, thank you guys for coming. I think this was great. I feel both, well, the last time we talked about tension, right? So but that's good. So I feel both tension and a hope, right? Like that sits within me right now, which is good. For me, that's a good thing. That means I've got work to do, It means I've got things to figure out and things to look at. And so I appreciate you being willing to come and talk to us and kind of present these ideas, and really kind of help us look. I really like the concept of the perpetuation of myths. That's sort of a membership issue. Like I guess I've never thought of it that way, that we are the ones that continue to perpetuate these myths. Otherwise they'd die. We have let plenty of things that prophets and apostles have said die. Like we really, really have. So I know we can do it. Like I know we can do that. So thank you very much for coming. Everybody else will see you guys again, I'm sure. And I appreciate you giving your time to us, Alice. I know you have a lot.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye. Okay.